Hey, so in our continuing study of Judaism, last time we left off with Moses and the two big themes of freedom and the law. And there's no more famous example of Jewish law than the Ten Commandments. These become the central pillar of the Jewish ethical life, and then by extension, the central pillar of the moral universe of Christianity and Islam in many key ways. So when we are studying the Ten Commandments, we have in our hands the map for a whole network of roads that travel out across the landscape of the Abrahamic faiths. It's a very exciting and potent part of the Torah. So when we're talking about the Ten Commandments, they're in two places in the Torah, but I'm going to focus on the spot everybody looks at first, and that is the book of Exodus, chapter 20, verses 1 through 17. So these, the story goes, are the laws that God literally etched on stone tablets and physically handed to Moses, and he brought them down the mountain. You know, I know of no other example in world religions where a deity prints a handout and gives it to a guy. I mean, to be serious about this for a moment, as is so often the case, a value is being communicated, imparted. There is a core theme at play in the Jewish tradition around the veracity of language, that God uses words to communicate his truth to his people. You know, think back to our study of Taoism, the opening line of the Tao Te Ching, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. All of that emphasis again and again and again on ineffability. That language is never going to cut it. That conceptual thought isn't going to bridge the gap between the sacred and the ordinary. But here in Judaism, things are just simpler. They're more grounded. They're more down to earth. God said it. He put it on a tablet and he handed it to us. We read it. Let's do it. And so the central power of the spoken and written word is so important in all three of the Western traditions. And it starts here with these stone tablets called the Ten Commandments. So let's just go through them and see briefly, because boy, you could do hours on each one of these, briefly what some of the themes are that come right to the surface when we just stop for a moment at each of the 10. So the first one isn't really a commandment, it's more of an identifying remark. God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So here, God isn't asking for a particular ethical behavior. Instead, he is reminding the Hebrews of the covenant and of, more specifically, his role in orchestrating their liberation from centuries of Egyptian bondage. So there's a little bit of a, I did this for you, and what are you going to do for me? Kind of a you owe me vibe. So I guess we could just headline that by saying this is a firm refresher moment on the idea of the covenant, the mutual binding relationship, the mutually beneficial relationship. And that last bit, you shall have no other gods before me. Curious, isn't it? You're tempted to say, well, that's monotheism. But he did not say there are no other gods. The language is always worth paying attention to. He said, you shall have no other gods before me, leaving the door open for other gods. And many have pointed this out, that he's talking to a group of people, these Israelites who have escaped centuries of residency in polytheistic Egypt. In other words, they've essentially become polytheists through osmosis. And he's communicating to them, let's get back to the one God thing. You know how it is when you live in a culture for generation after generation after generation. You become assimilated. The value system of where you live becomes woven into your value system. It's inescapable. So by saying you shall have no other gods before me, perhaps God is simply drawing the Hebrews back into monotheism. Some have interpreted that passage to mean still richer things. Don't make other things more important than God. Money can become a god. Our careers can become a quote unquote god. Our bodies, certainly our egos. So on a subtler, perhaps more spiritual plane, this phrase, "You shall have no other gods before me," is a reminder of, well, here's how Jesus puts it in the Sermon on the Mount. Put first the kingdom of God, and all else will be granted to you. Spiritual, divine prioritization. Now, the second commandment, things get bigger and more complicated. The second commandment is the longest of the 10. Let me just read it to you. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the iniquity of their parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. I think there's three big ideas going on here in the second commandment. The first one, don't make graven images. Don't make idols of me. God is saying to the Hebrews, don't turn me into a three-dimensional form, which again is a break with Egyptian religion and the polytheistic religions of all their neighbors. In many of those cases, gods lived in statues in temples. And this is a God who's saying, let's do it different. I need to remain boundless and imageless. The mystery of mysteries, if reduced to a three-dimensional statue, is destroyed, is distorted. So the imageless, formless God is what is being asserted here. And what's fascinating is that in Judaism and in Islam, they cleave close to this teaching right up to today. You won't see images of God or the prophets in a mosque, in a synagogue, in a Jewish temple. And so what happened in Christianity? Because I know you're thinking, wow, there's a lot of images in Christianity. Yeah, I guess we can talk about that more later, but clearly out of the early Christian church in those first centuries in ancient Rome, in the 3rd and 4th century, the decision, they know how to read. They're reading this passage too. The decision is made, let's use imagery to teach the stories of the Bible to a largely illiterate population. Remember, in the 4th century, there's no printing press. Books cost $10,000. I'm just pulling a number out of the air. They're handwritten. They're extremely rare. No one knows how to read anyway. How do you teach Bible stories with images? And that happened very quickly in the Christian tradition. So Christianity goes one way, Judaism and Islam goes the other on this imagery question. Now, more interestingly, I suppose, than that is what happens next. God says, you shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the iniquity of their parents to the 3rd and 4th generation. So the rabbis of Judaism wrestle with this. This sounds like a capricious, unjust God. Does it make sense to you to to punish a child for something that their great-great-great-grandfather did? How is that just? How is that just to punish someone for something that happened 4 generations ago? So what does it mean, really, when God says, that he will visit the iniquity of the fathers on the sons and the daughters for generations to come. Iniquity means, sometimes it's translated as sin. It means weakness, flaw, something that isn't right. So think about what might really be communicated here. Not that God is a capricious God who not only punishes sinners, but passes that punishment on for 4 generations. Maybe it's this. Can you think of an example of how my iniquity as a father, as a parent, my limitation, my sin, might negatively impact my children so severely that they would pass it on to their children, and they would pass it on to their, and it could travel down through the generations? Of course we can. We talk often in social work about the cycle of violence, domestic violence, sexual abuse, alcoholism, addiction. There are many human errors and weaknesses and obsessions that damage not only the agent committing those actions, but their children. And then those children grow up and in many cases repeat those cycles. So what if this curious passage about God punishing the children for the iniquity of the parents is less about a capricious, cruel, and judgmental God, and more about the moral responsibility that you and I have as parents? Is our home a safe place? Are children in our homes valued, respected, loved, reminded of their goodness, held up to principles and ideals that make their life infinitely richer? Or is our home a dangerous place for them, of cruelty, of indifference, or worse? So, as is often the case when you start to dig into Jewish teachings, the Jewish law, quickly layer after layer after layer after layer begin to reveal themselves. And this starts to shift from a passage about a judgmental God into a passage about moral responsibility. There's that ethical dimension again, that you and I literally make the world through how we raise our children. You know, let's say I have 4 kids, and in the next generation, each of those 4 kids has 4 kids. And you can do the math, the geometric expansion, you know, in 100 years, we're talking about 10,000 people. So the goodness or the badness that I build with my partner in my home for my kids, we could put this in terms of karma, right? Sends karmic ripples out into successive generations. The individual is the microcosm of the family, and the family is the microcosm of the tribe, and the tribes are the microcosm of the nations, and the nations are the microcosms of the world. So personal moral responsibility is what makes the world what it is. I'm thinking about Confucianism too, as we pour down deeply into these Jewish ideas. So that's just the first 2. Let's take a break. When we get back together, let's look at part 2 of our study of the 10 Commandments, and we'll move a little more quickly now that we've got a feel for how this midrash or interpretation process works. So in part 2 of the 10 Commandments, we'll take up the 3rd commandment and go from there.